Tonight, we will journey through the complete history of Gondor, from its legendary founding by Elendil and his sons, to the glory of its greatest kings, the long centuries of decline, the courage of its stewards, the War of the Ring, and finally, the return of the king. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the ancient stones of Gondor tell their story. And if you enjoy exploring the rich history of Middle-earth, I'd truly appreciate it if you'd subscribe to Nightfall Stories. Now, our journey begins where all great kingdoms begin, with the fall of another. At last, the survivors reached Middle-earth. To many, it seemed a wild land compared to the grandeur they had lost. Ancient forests stretched beyond sight. Wide rivers flowed through empty plains. The mountains stood silent beneath drifting clouds. But for Elendil, this was not exile alone. It was hope. Here, the faithful would begin again. Elendil landed in the north, where he founded the kingdom of Arnor. His sons sailed farther south. There, beside the mighty river Anduin, Isildur and Anarion established a second realm. This kingdom they named Gondor, the land of stone. Its location was no accident. The great river provided trade, fertile lands, and swift communication. The White Mountains formed a natural shield to the south. To the east lay the shadowed lands that Sauron had once ruled. The danger remained close, but so did the resolve to oppose it. Unlike many kingdoms that grew slowly over centuries, Gondor rose with astonishing speed. Its founders brought with them the knowledge of Númenor. Master builders shaped enormous blocks of stone with skills few others possessed. Roads stretched across the countryside, bridges crossed mighty rivers, watchtowers crowned distant hills. Everything was built to endure. At the heart of the kingdom stood Osgiliath, the citadel of stars. The city rose upon both banks of the Anduin, joined by magnificent bridges whose graceful arches reflected in the flowing water below. Merchants arrived from distant lands. Scholars copied ancient records rescued from Númenor. Ships crowded the quays. Gardens bloomed within the city's walls. At night, lanterns shimmered across the river like constellations brought down from the heavens. It quickly became one of the greatest cities ever built by men. To the west, upon the slopes of Mount Mindolwyn, Anarion raised Minas Morgul, the tower of the setting sun. Strong walls climbed the mountainside. Its position allowed watchmen to observe the plains for many miles. Though already formidable, no one yet imagined it would one day become the greatest fortress in Middle-earth. Far to the east stood its twin, Minas Ithil, the tower of the rising moon. White walls gleamed beneath the morning light. Its gardens were renowned for their beauty. Within its courts grew the sapling descended from the fruit Isildur had rescued before Númenor fell. The white tree lived once again. Its blossoms became a living reminder that although kingdoms may perish, hope can survive. For many years, the twin cities watched over the land together. One greeted the sunrise, the other welcomed the evening. Between them flowed the great river that nourished the kingdom, and at the center, Osgiliath shone like a jewel. The foundations of Gondor had been laid, not merely upon stone, but upon memory. The memory of a lost homeland. The wisdom of forgotten ages, and the determination that the mistakes of Númenor would never again be repeated. Yet even as new walls rose beside the Anduin, far to the east, within the black land of Mordor, an ancient shadow was beginning to stir once more. The first years of Gondor were filled with purpose. Villages spread across the fertile plains of Anarion. Farmers cultivated rich fields beside the Anduin. Stone roads reached farther into the countryside with every passing season, linking new settlements to the growing cities. Along those roads traveled merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and soldiers, each contributing to the slow but steady growth of the young kingdom. To those who lived within its borders, it seemed that the darkest days had finally passed. Númenor had been lost. Many dear friends and family had vanished beneath the waves. Yet, the faithful had endured. From tragedy, they had built something beautiful once more. But beyond the Ethel Duoth, the Mountains of Shadow, another survivor had also escaped the downfall of Númenor. Sauron. Though the destruction of the island had robbed him forever of the fair form he had once worn, his spirit endured. When he returned to Mordor, he found much of his realm waiting for him. The foundations of Barad-dûr still stood. The fires of Orodruin still burned beneath the mountain. The orcs who had fled after earlier defeats gathered once again beneath his banner. Slowly, the Dark Lord rebuilt his strength. He remembered the Númenorians. He remembered their armies. He remembered that among all the peoples of Middle-earth, only they possessed the power to oppose him openly. And now, they had settled almost within sight of his own borders. War became inevitable. In the year 349 of the Second Age, Sauron struck first. His armies poured from the Black Gate like a tide of iron. Orcs marched beneath black banners. Great trolls shook the earth beneath their heavy footsteps. Wargs raced ahead through the valleys. Clouds of ash drifted westward from Mount Doom until daylight itself grew dim. The first target was Minas Tirith. Standing nearest to Mordor, the beautiful city had little warning before the assault began. Its defenders fought bravely upon the white walls. Archers filled the air with arrows. The gates held against repeated attacks. Yet Sauron's forces seemed endless. Day after day, they pressed forward. Eventually, the city fell. Flames consumed its houses. The white tree that Isildur had nurtured there was burned. The beautiful tower of the rising moon became a fortress of darkness. Only a few survivors escaped. Among them was Isildur himself. Taking with him his wife, his young son, and a handful of loyal followers, he fled north by ship along the Anduin. Though forced to abandon the city, he refused to abandon hope. Before leaving, he had once again preserved a seedling from the white tree. For the second time in his life, he rescued the future of Gondor in the form of a single living sapling. Meanwhile, Anarion remained behind. For Minas Anir, he gathered every soldier he could muster. His task was not to reclaim Minas Ithil. Not yet. His duty was to ensure that Gondor itself survived. The western provinces rallied. Messengers rode day and night along the great roads. Beacons were not yet needed, for every village already understood the danger. This was no border raid. This was the return of the enemy that had nearly conquered the world. Far to the north, Isildur reached Arnor. There he sought the aid of his father. Elendil needed little convincing. He had watched a smoke rising from the south. He knew the time for preparation had ended. the faithful would stand together. Yet even the united strength of Arnor and Gondor might not be enough. So Elendil turned to the oldest allies of his people, the elves. Messengers traveled east to Rivendell. Others crossed forests to the Woodland Realm. Most importantly, word reached Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor remaining in Middle-earth. Gil-galad had fought Sauron before. He understood better than anyone still living the cost of allowing darkness to grow unchecked. Without hesitation, he answered the call. Thus began the greatest alliance ever forged between elves and men, not for conquest, not for glory, but for survival. Across Middle-earth, armies gathered. The Dunedain marched beneath the star of Elendil. The elves carried banners that had flown since the Elder Days. Lords who had once ruled in Beleriand now stood beside kings descended from Númenor. Old friendships were renewed. Ancient oaths remembered. Never again would such an alliance exist. When the hosts finally assembled, they stretched farther than the eye could see. Thousands upon thousands of warriors prepared to march east. The crossing of the Misty Mountains was slow. Supply wagons followed behind the armies. Blacksmiths repaired armor each evening. Campfires filled the valleys after sunset. Although many soldiers understood the danger awaiting them, few abandoned hope. For among them walked Elendil, tall as the greatest of men. Beside him strode Gil-galad, whose armor shone like silver beneath the morning sun. And near them rode Isildur and Anarion, the brothers who had founded Gondor together. The sight alone inspired courage. At last, the alliance reached the plains before Mordor. There, upon the Dagorlad, the battle plain, they found Sauron's vast army waiting. The battle that followed became one of the greatest conflicts in all the history of Middle-earth. The clash of steel echoed across the plain from dawn until darkness. Elven spears met orcish shields. The Númenorians fought with discipline unmatched by any army of men. Even the orcs feared the tall warriors whose bright mail reflected the firelight. Many songs later claimed that the very earth trembled beneath the struggle. Though centuries have passed, no one can truly know every deed performed upon that battlefield. Countless acts of courage were never recorded. Countless names were forgotten. But their sacrifice made victory possible. By the end of the battle, Sauron's forces had been broken. The survivors fled behind the Black Gate. Yet the war was far from over. Barad-dûr still stood. Its walls were too mighty to storm, its towers too high to scale, and within them, the Dark Lord still waited. So the last alliance began a siege unlike any before or since, one that would last not days, not months, but years. When at last the war against Sauron had ended, Middle-earth entered a time unlike any it had known for generations. The fires of Mount Doom still smoldered in the distance. The broken stones of Barad-dûr lay scattered across the plain. Countless graves marked the places where elves and men had fallen during the last alliance. Victory had been won, but victory always carries a price. Among those who survived stood Isildur, eldest son of Elendil. He had witnessed the deaths of both his father and his brother. He had seen kingdoms nearly destroyed before they had truly begun. And now, with the one ring in his possession, he faced another responsibility. the northern kingdom of Arnor awaited its king. Although Isildur had helped establish Gondor beside the Anduin, it had never been intended as his permanent realm. Elendil had ruled as High King of both Arnor and Gondor, while his sons governed the southern kingdom in his name. With Elendil gone, that duty now passed to Isildur. Yet Gondor would not be left without a ruler. Before departing north, Isildur entrusted the kingdom to his nephew, Menelil, the son of Anarion. It was a decision born not only of necessity, but of wisdom. Menelil had been raised within Gondor from childhood. He knew its people, its cities, its rivers, its fields. While Isildur's future lay in the north, Menelil's life had always belonged to the southern kingdom. Thus, Menelil became the first independent king of Gondor. It was a quiet beginning. There was no grand celebration, no magnificent coronation remembered in song. The kingdom was still recovering from war. Homes needed rebuilding. Roads required repair. Families mourned fathers, brothers, and sons who would never return from Mordor. The greatest task before the new king was not conquest, it was healing. Fortunately, Gondor possessed strengths unlike any other realm of men. Its builders carried the knowledge of Númenor. Its archives preserved centuries of wisdom rescued from the fallen island. Its fertile lands produced abundant harvests, and the great river Anduin connected distant provinces more efficiently than any road could. Slowly, life began to settle once again. The sound of hammers echoed through Osgiliath as damaged bridges were repaired. Farmers returned to fields abandoned during the war. Fishing boats appeared once more upon the river. Children played beneath the walls without remembering the fear their parents had endured. Peace has a quiet way of rebuilding what war destroys. Under Menelil's rule, Osgiliath continued to flourish. Known as the Citadel of Stars, it stood proudly upon both banks of the Anduin, its districts connected by magnificent stone bridges that reflected in the calm waters below. Travelers arriving from Pelargir often spoke first of the city's beauty. Its white buildings gleamed beneath the southern sun. Tall towers overlooked broad streets lined with merchants and craftsmen. Libraries preserved ancient scrolls brought from Númenor. Scholars devoted their lives to copying old texts so that knowledge would never again be lost to the sea. Unlike many cities that grew without order, Osgiliath had been carefully planned. Wide avenues allowed trade to move freely between marketplaces. Gardens softened the stone with flowering trees and flowing fountains. The voices of many peoples could be heard in its streets. Men from Bilfalis, sailors from Pelennor, messengers from Ithilien. Even elves occasionally passed through its gates while traveling between the north and the havens of the south. Though Gondor remained a kingdom of men, it had not forgotten the friendships forged during the last alliance. Far to the southwest, another city grew steadily in importance, Pelargir. Long before the downfall of Númenor, it had served as one of the Faithful's greatest harbors in Middle-earth. Now, it became the beating heart of Gondor's maritime power. Its quays stretched for great distances along the river. Ships of every size crowded its docks. Some carried timber from the forests. Others transported grain from fertile provinces. Fine cloth, wine, iron, and stone passed through Pelargir, before continuing to every corner of the kingdom. The sea, once a symbol of terrible loss, slowly became a source of prosperity once again. The Númenóreans had always been master sailors. That tradition did not perish with their island. Shipwriters continued to build strong vessels capable of crossing vast waters. Captains explored distant shores. Trade reached kingdoms whose names rarely appeared in the chronicles of Gondor. Prosperity flowed inland alongside the Anduin. Meanwhile, Minas Anor stood watch upon the western slopes of Mount Mindalluin. Its walls remained strong. Its towers watched the eastern horizon. Though no longer threatened by immediate war, its garrison never abandoned vigilance. The memory of Sauron's assault remained fresh. No king wished to be caught unprepared again. East of the river lay Minas Ithil. Though scarred by the war, it too began to recover. Its gardens were replanted, its white walls repaired. The sapling of the white tree continued to grow, becoming a quiet reminder that hope had survived even the greatest darkness. For many years, the twin cities once again guarded the eastern frontier together. One greeted the rising sun, the other watched it set. Between them flowed the Anduin, carrying with it the lifeblood of Gondor. These became the early golden years of the kingdom, not because there were no dangers, but because wisdom still guided its rulers. Elendil understood that kingdoms endure not only through mighty armies, but through justice, good roads, thriving farms, honest trade, and peaceful lives. While soldiers defended the borders, ordinary people built the future, stone by stone, field by field, generation by generation. Few who lived during those peaceful decades could imagine that one day Osgiliath would stand in ruins, or that the line of kings itself would one day disappear. For now, Gondor stood as the greatest realm of men in Middle-earth, strong, prosperous, confident. Its banners flew proudly above cities that seemed destined to endure forever. But history has a gentle way of reminding even the greatest kingdoms that peace is never permanent. And many generations after Elendil, the greatest threat to Gondor would not come from Mordor. It would come from within its own royal house. For nearly 15 centuries after the reign of Elendil, the kingdom of Gondor endured. Kings succeeded their fathers. Harvests came and went with the turning of the seasons. The white tree continued to bloom within the courts of the kings, its branches stretching ever higher toward the southern sky. There were wars, as there always are. The Easterlings tested Gondor's eastern borders. Corsairs appeared upon the seas. The wild lands beyond the White Mountains were never entirely free of danger. Yet through each challenge, the line of Anarion remained unbroken. The kingdom grew stronger with every generation. Its roads stretched farther across Middle-earth. Its armies became renowned for their discipline. Its cities flourished beneath wise rulers whose ancestry reached back to Elendil himself. Many historians would later remember these centuries as Gondor's greatest age. But even the mightiest kingdoms are not always undone by enemies beyond their walls. Sometimes, their greatest wounds are inflicted by their own hands. The beginning of Gondor's darkest civil conflict came during the reign of King Valakar. Unlike many of his ancestors, Valakar had spent much of his youth far from the great cities of Gondor. His father, King Roman II, had sent him as an ambassador to the kingdom of Ravañan, whose people lived beyond the river Anduin upon the wide northern plains. There, among those hardy men of the north, Valakar found something unexpected. Not merely loyal allies, but love. He married Vidamavi, daughter of the king of Rhovanion, to Valakar. The marriage symbolized friendship between two noble peoples who had long fought the same enemies. Their son, Eldakar, inherited the blood of both kingdoms. He possessed the wisdom of Númenor through his father's line, and the courage of the north through his mother. Yet not every lord of Gondor welcomed this union. Among the proud nobles of the southern provinces, whispers began long before Eldakar reached adulthood. Some questioned whether the blood of Númenor had become diluted. Others believed that only those descended entirely from the ancient faithful should ever wear the crown. These murmurs remained quiet while Valakar lived, but when he died, they became open resentment. Dakar inherited the throne as the rightful king. By law, no one could dispute his claim. Yet many powerful nobles refused to accept him in their hearts. Among them stood one of Gondor's greatest captains, Castamir. Known throughout the kingdom as Castamir the Usurper, though history would give him that name only later. At the time, he was admired, a brilliant naval commander, a veteran of many victories, a descendant of Elendil himself. He believed that Gondor required a ruler of pure Númenorian blood. Whether this belief arose from genuine conviction, personal ambition, or a mixture of both, only Castamir himself ever truly knew. The kingdom slowly divided. Some remained loyal to Eldakar, others pledged themselves to Castamir. Families found themselves standing on opposite sides. Old friendships quietly dissolved. Merchants hesitated before speaking openly in crowded marketplaces. Every conversation carried the fear that the wrong words might reveal dangerous loyalties. Then, the arguments ended, and the swords were drawn. The Kin-strife had begun. Never before had Gondor witnessed such sorrow. Brother marched against brother. Cities that had once celebrated the same festivals now raised different banners. The great roads built by the kings of old carried armies instead of merchants. The fiercest struggle came at Osgiliath, for whoever controlled the capital controlled Gondor itself. The Citadel of Stars, once the greatest city of men, became a battlefield. Its magnificent bridges echoed with the clash of steel. Arrow fire darkened the sky above the Anduin. Stone buildings that had survived for centuries collapsed beneath siege engines and flames. For days, the fighting raged through streets once filled with scholars and traders. Many priceless records rescued from Númenor were lost forever. Ancient scrolls, genealogies, maps, works of history copied across generations. Fire consumed them without mercy. Some losses cannot be measured in lives alone. When the battle ended, Castamir emerged victorious. King Eldakar was forced to flee northward into Ravañan, seeking refuge among his mother's people. Castamir entered Osgiliath not as its liberator, but as its new ruler. For 10 years he governed Gondor. His reign strengthened the navy and enriched Pelagir, whose great harbor had long been his source of power. Yet many people soon discovered that military brilliance does not always produce wise kingship. Castamir cared little for Osgiliath, little for the northern provinces, little for those who questioned his rule. His government grew increasingly harsh. Executions became more common. Fear settled across the kingdom. Even some who had originally supported him began to regret their choice. Meanwhile, far beyond Gondor's borders, Eldacar waited patiently. He did not surrender his claim. Among the men of Rovanion, he gathered loyal supporters. Years passed. His son grew older. The exiled king watched and waited for the moment when Gondor itself had grown weary of division. At last, he returned. The final battles of the Kin-strife proved every bit as bitter as the first. Once again, Gondorians fought Gondorians. Once again, the fields beside the Anduin drank the blood of those who should have stood together. This time, however, fortune favored Eldacar. Castamir fell in battle. The rightful king reclaimed his throne. Yet victory could not erase what had already been lost. The wounds of civil war remained long after the swords were sheathed. The greatest consequence came not upon the battlefield, but upon the sea. The sons of Castamir escaped aboard ships with many of their followers. They sailed south, far from Osgiliath, far from the authority of the king. They settled in Umbar. There, the hatred born during the Kin-strife did not fade. Instead, it was carefully preserved. For generations to come, the descendants of Castamir would rule the corsairs of Umbar. Again and again, their black ships would raid Gondor's coasts. Again and again, old bitterness would return with the tide. Thus ended the Kin-strife. Eldacar wore the crown once more. Peace slowly returned. But Gondor had learned a painful lesson. The walls of its cities were strong enough to withstand armies. Its soldiers were brave enough to defeat foreign kings. Yet even the greatest kingdom in Middle-earth could be brought to its knees when pride divided the hearts of its own people. By the time the wounds of the Kin-strife had begun to fade, Gondor had once again become a kingdom of remarkable strength. The scars of civil war still lingered in memory, but new generations had grown up knowing only peace. Trade flowed once more along the Anduin. Farmers worked the rich fields of Anarion and Lebanon. Merchant ships filled the harbors of Pelagir, carrying goods to distant shores, while Osgiliath remained the proud heart of the realm. The kings who followed Eldacar worked patiently to restore what had been broken. Cities were rebuilt, roads repaired, fortresses strengthened. For many decades, Gondor seemed to have recovered from its greatest internal crisis. Yet history rarely repeats the same tragedy. Instead, it finds new paths. The next great blow would come not from ambitious nobles, not from invading armies, not even from Mordor. It would arrive unseen, without banners, without siege engines, without warning. Far to the east, beyond lands scarcely known to the chroniclers of Gondor, whispers began to spread of a terrible sickness. Entire villages fell silent. Travelers disappeared from the roads. Markets emptied. No army marched with the plague. It traveled with merchants, with caravans, with ordinary people carrying no weapon more dangerous than the breath within their lungs. At first, few in Gondor paid much attention. The kingdom had survived countless dangers. News of distant illness seemed no different from the many rumors that reached Osgiliath each year. But slowly, those rumors came closer. The first reports arrived from the eastern provinces, then from Ithilien, Soon afterward, sickness appeared along the banks of the Anduin itself. The physicians of Gondor had inherited much wisdom from Númenor. They understood herbs, clean water, the treatment of wounds. But against this unseen enemy, their knowledge offered little protection. The illness spread with terrifying speed. Families that had shared supper together were mourning one another within days. Busy streets emptied. The laughter of children disappeared from village squares. Doors remained closed. Church bells, or their Gondorian equivalents of mourning, seemed never to fall silent. No sword could strike down such an enemy. No fortress wall could keep it out. King Pelennor watched with growing despair as the plague swept through his kingdom. Like every good ruler before him, he remained with his people instead of fleeing to safer lands. It was an honorable decision. It would also prove fatal. Pelennor died. So did every one of his children. In a matter of weeks, the royal house itself stood on the edge of extinction. Across Gondor, entire noble families vanished. Ancient bloodlines ended without heirs. Villages disappeared from maps because no one remained alive to inhabit them. The fields went untilled. Livestock wandered unattended across abandoned farms. Nature slowly reclaimed places where people had lived for generations. Perhaps nowhere was the disaster felt more deeply than in Osgiliath. For centuries, the city had stood as the jewel of Gondor. Its bridges united both banks of the Anduin. Its libraries preserved the greatest collection of Númenorian knowledge remaining in Middle-earth. Its streets bustled with merchants from every province. Now, those same streets became eerily quiet. Many homes stood empty. Market stalls remained abandoned. The voices that had once echoed beneath its stone arches were replaced by silence. Even after the plague eventually passed, Osgiliath would never fully recover. Its decline had begun. Farther east, the consequences proved equally severe. The fortress city of Minas Ithil had long served as Gondor's eastern shield. Its soldiers watched constantly toward Mordor, ensuring that no shadow could return unnoticed. But as the plague claimed thousands of lives, its garrison shrank. Fewer men remained to guard the walls. Fewer watchfires burned through the night. The defenses that had protected Gondor for centuries quietly weakened. No enemy took advantage immediately, but history would remember this moment as the beginning of a far greater danger. The plague spared no province. Anarion suffered. Lossarnac mourned its dead. Lebanon, Belfalis, and the southern coasts all counted terrible losses. Even Pelargir, whose harbor had brought such wealth to Gondor, now found itself vulnerable because the same ships that carried prosperity had also carried disease. Trade slowed almost to nothing. Many captains refused to sail. Others found no ports willing to receive them. For the first time in centuries, the mighty kingdom seemed uncertain of its future. Yet, amid so much sorrow, acts of quiet courage appeared everywhere. Healers continued tending the sick, despite knowing the danger. Neighbors shared food with families unable to leave their homes. Soldiers maintained lonely watches upon the walls, though their own households had already been touched by grief. These were not the great heroes remembered in songs. No bard would compose verses about them. But kingdoms endure because of such people. Ordinary men and women who choose compassion when fear would be easier. Eventually, the sickness began to fade. Just as mysteriously as it had arrived, it slowly loosened its grip upon Gondor. Life returned, carefully, cautiously. Children could once again be heard playing in village lanes. Fields were planted, markets reopened. Ships returned to Pelargir. But the kingdom that emerged was not the same one that had existed before. Too many had been lost. Entire regions stood sparsely populated. Ancient families had disappeared forever. Most importantly, Gondor's strength had been quietly diminished. Its armies were smaller, its cities less crowded, its eastern defenses weaker than at any time since the last alliance. Far beyond the Efelduath, something ancient was watching, waiting, patient as the passing of centuries. The Great Plague had accomplished what no invading army ever could. It had left Gondor vulnerable, and before many generations had passed, an old enemy would return to claim the city that had once stood proudly beneath the light of the rising moon. The Great Plague left Gondor wounded. Its cities still stood. Its banners still flew above proud fortresses. The line of kings had survived, but beneath the appearance of strength, something had changed. The kingdom no longer possessed the countless soldiers it once had. Many watchtowers along the eastern frontier were manned by only a handful of guards. Villages that had supplied generations of warriors now struggled simply to recover their own population. The scars of the plague could not be repaired in a single lifetime. For a time, however, the land remained peaceful. The years passed quietly. Children were born who knew the Great Plague only through the stories of their grandparents. Harvests once again filled the granaries. Merchants returned to the Great West Road. The white tree continued to blossom beneath the walls of Minas Ithil. Hope slowly returned. Yet, far beyond the mountains of shadow, another power had also survived the passing centuries, the Nazgul. Long ago, they had served Sauron during the Second Age. When the Dark Ward fell at the end of the last alliance, they vanished from sight. Many believed they had passed into nothingness. Others whispered that such servants could never truly perish while the One Ring endured. Those whispers proved true. Nearly 1,000 years after the Great Plague, the Lord of the Nazgul returned, no longer merely as Sauron's greatest servant. He came as the ruler of his own dark kingdom. In the valleys north of the arid Lithwi, the Witch King established the realm of Ungmah, where he had already brought about the destruction of Arnor. Now, with the northern kingdom of the Dunedain broken and scattered, his gaze turned south, toward Gondor. He did not march immediately. Like his master, the Witch King understood patience. He waited while Gondor continued to weaken through smaller wars and the slow passage of time. He knew that kingdoms rarely fall in a single battle. They first grow tired. Their strength diminishes generation after generation. Then, the final blow becomes possible. In the year 2000 of the Third Age, that moment arrived. The armies of the Witch King crossed into Ithilien. Dark banners appeared once more upon the eastern horizon. Orcs marched beside evil men from distant lands. Creatures that had long hidden within the mountains emerged to join the assault. Their destination was clear from the very beginning. Minas Ithil. For nearly 3,000 years, the Tower of the Rising Moon had guarded Gondor's eastern frontier. Its white walls had watched the borders of Mordor since the days of Isildur and Anarion. Within its courts still grew the white tree, descended from the fruit Isildur had rescued before the downfall of Númenor. The city represented far more than stone and mortar. It was a living symbol of Gondor's beginnings. Its defenders resisted with every strength they possessed. The walls had been built by the master craftsmen of Númenor. The towers overlooked every approach. Archers filled the battlements. For 2 long years, Minas Ithil endured the siege. Again and again, the enemy assaulted its gates. Again and again, they were driven back. The soldiers of Gondor understood that they were defending not only a city, but the memory of their ancestors. Yet, the balance of power had changed since the days of the last alliance. The kingdom could no longer gather armies as vast as those that had once marched beneath Elendil. Too many centuries had passed. Too many lives had been lost to plague, war, and time. Reinforcements came, but never in sufficient numbers. Slowly, the defenses began to fail. In the year 2002, Minas Ithil fell. The white city of the moon was taken by darkness. Its surviving defenders fled westward across the Anduin. Those who escaped carried little more than the clothes they wore and the memories of the home they had lost. Among the treasures rescued from the city was one object of immeasurable value: the young white tree. Before the enemy could seize it, the defenders saved another sapling and carried it safely to Minas-Morgul. It was the 3rd time in history that the line of the white tree had been preserved against impossible odds. The city itself, however, was lost forever. No longer would it be known as Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Rising Moon. The servants of darkness gave it another name: Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery. Its once white walls took on a sickly, ghostly glow. The beautiful gardens disappeared beneath poisonous growth. Where songs had once echoed through peaceful courtyards, only silence remained. The city became the dwelling place of the Nazgul. From its towers rode the ring wraiths. Its gates opened for armies serving the shadow. Travelers who passed too near its walls spoke of cold fear settling upon them long before they caught sight of the city itself. Even daylight seemed weaker there. Across the river, Gondor watched helplessly. The loss of Minas Ithil forced a change that would shape the kingdom forever. Minas Anor, once the tower of the setting sun, now stood as the principal fortress guarding the western bank of the Anduin. Its purpose had changed. It was no longer simply a companion to its eastern twin. It had become Gondor's last great shield. In time, its name changed as well. It became Minas Tirith, the Tower of Guard. A name that reflected not beauty, but duty. The kingdom had lost one of its greatest cities, but it refused to surrender. Stone by stone, the walls of Minas Tirith were strengthened. Its garrison expanded. New defenses were built. The people of Gondor understood that another great war would one day come. They simply did not know when. Far across the river, the green glow of Minas Morgul burned through the night, a constant reminder that the shadow had returned. The eastern gate of Gondor had fallen, and although the White City still stood proud beneath Mount Mindolluin, its kings could no longer ignore the truth. The long war against Mordor had begun once again. The fall of Minas Ithil was not the end of Gondor's troubles. It was only the beginning of a long, slow twilight. For centuries, the kings of Gondor continued to rule from Minas Tirith. They remained courageous, leading their armies against the Easterlings, the Haradrim, and the growing darkness beyond the Elendil. Some won great victories. Others struggled merely to preserve what their ancestors had built. Each generation inherited a kingdom a little smaller than the one before, not because its rulers lacked wisdom, nor because its soldiers lacked courage, but because time itself is an enemy that no kingdom can defeat forever. The line of Anarion, once so numerous, grew steadily thinner. Sons were lost in battle. Heirs died of sickness. Some kings left no children at all. With every passing century, the burden resting upon the royal house became heavier. Yet Gondor endured. Its people continued to look toward the White Tower with confidence, believing that as long as a king sat upon the throne, the realm would survive. Then came the reign of King Gondor. Like many of his forefathers, he faced growing threats from the east. The Wainriders, fierce warriors who rode great wagons across the plains beyond the Sea of Rune, had become one of Gondor's most dangerous enemies. They were relentless, patient, and skilled in war. For many years, they tested Gondor's borders, searching for weakness. At last, they launched a great invasion. King Ondahare marched to meet them. Beside him rode both of his sons, Ardamir and Faramir, determined to defend the kingdom as generations of kings had done before them. The battle that followed proved disastrous. The armies of Gondor fought with their usual discipline and courage, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the assault. When the fighting ended, King Ondor lay dead upon the field. Both of his sons had fallen beside him. In a single day, the direct line of succession disappeared. News of the disaster spread quickly through Minas Tirith. For the first time in centuries, Gondor faced a question it had rarely needed to answer. Who would now wear the crown? There were those who believed the answer had already been given. Far to the north, Arvedui, king of Arthedain, claimed the throne through his wife Firiel, the daughter of Ondahare. As the last surviving kingdom of Arnor, Arthedain still preserved the northern line of Elendil. Arvedui argued that the realms founded by Elendil should once again be united beneath a single high king. His claim possessed both history and reason. Many believed it just. But Gondor's council saw matters differently. The kingdom had long governed itself independently. Its laws favored succession through the male line, and many feared that accepting Arvedui would place Gondor under the authority of a distant northern kingdom already struggling against Angmar. Instead, the council chose another descendant of Anarion, Eärnil, a celebrated captain whose victories against the Wainriders had already earned him great respect throughout the realm. The decision prevented a succession crisis. It also marked something deeper. The ancient dream of the reunited kingdoms quietly faded. From that day forward, Arnor and Gondor would continue along separate paths. Eärnil proved himself a worthy king. He restored confidence after the terrible losses suffered under Ondahare. His armies drove back Gondor's enemies. Its borders stabilized once more. For a brief time, hope returned. Then, history dealt another cruel blow. King Eärnil had only one son, Eärnur. Unlike many rulers before him, Eärnur was renowned first as a warrior. Tall, fearless, and proud, he possessed extraordinary skill in battle. He rode against the Witch King himself during the final wars against Angmar in the north, witnessing firsthand the destruction of that evil realm. It was during those campaigns that the Lord of the Nazgul began to recognize the pride within Eärnar's heart. Pride can be a strength. It can also become a weapon in the hands of one's enemies. When Eärnar became king of Gondor, the Witch King challenged him openly. The first challenge came soon after his coronation. The Lord of Minas Morgul mocked him, daring him to single combat beneath the walls of the cursed city. Eärnar wished to accept. Only the wise counsel of his advisors restrained him. For a time. Years later, another challenge arrived. This one was even more insulting than the first. The Witch King questioned Eärnar's courage before all of Gondor. To ignore such words wounded the king's pride. Against every warning, he accepted. Eärnar rode east with a small company of knights. The gates of Minas Morgul opened before them. The king disappeared into the City of Shadows. He was never seen again. No messenger returned. No body was recovered. No song tells what truly happened beyond those haunted walls. Only silence. With the disappearance of Eärnar in the year 2500 of the Third Age, the line of the kings of Gondor came to an end. For nearly 3,000 years, descendants of Elendil and Anarion had ruled the southern kingdom. Now, the throne stood empty. There were distant relatives. There were noble houses with ancient blood, but none possessed a claim accepted by all. Rather than risk another kin-strife, the people of Gondor chose a different path. The steward of the king would rule the kingdom until the king returned. At first, no one imagined the arrangement would last very long. Perhaps a few years, perhaps a generation. Surely another rightful heir would soon be found. But years became decades. Decades became centuries. The White Throne remained empty. Its silent presence reminded every ruler who followed that Gondor was being preserved, not possessed. The stewards wore no crown. They sat beneath the king's throne, never upon it. They carried a white rod as the symbol of their office, rather than a royal scepter. Each steward swore that he governed only in trust, keeping the kingdom safe for the day when the true king would return. Many believed that day would never come. Yet through all the long centuries that followed, the stewards never forgot the promise. And because they did not forget, Gondor itself endured. For the first time since the founding of the realm, Gondor had no king. The White Throne stood empty beneath the Tower of Acthelion. No royal crown rested upon a ruler's brow. No voice descended directly from Elendil or Anarion to command the kingdom. Instead, the stewards governed in the king's name. It was an arrangement born of necessity rather than ambition. Each steward accepted the white rod as a symbol of service, not sovereignty. They maintained the laws, commanded the armies, and judged disputes throughout the realm. Yet none dared to claim the crown for himself. The throne remained untouched. Waiting. Many believed that only a few years would pass before a rightful heir appeared. Then, a few years became a century. A century became two. Eventually, generations of Gondorians were born having never known a king at all. Still, the stewards ruled wisely. Among the greatest of them was Mardel Voronway, the first ruling steward. His title carried a solemn promise. he would govern only until the king returned. Every steward after him renewed that same oath. It became more than tradition. It became part of Gondor's very identity. Even as memory faded, hope endured. Yet, the shadow did not sleep. From the walls of Minas Morgul, the Witch King watched patiently. He no longer needed to conquer Gondor in a single overwhelming assault. Time had become his greatest ally. The lands east of the Anduin remained dangerous. Ithilien, once a green and prosperous province filled with farms and villages, slowly transformed into a frontier. Its people lived with constant uncertainty. Watchfires burned throughout the night. Families built their homes close to fortified settlements. Messengers traveled in armed companies rather than alone. The forests themselves seemed quieter than before. Many abandoned the eastern lands altogether, seeking safety behind the walls of Minas Tirith or farther south in the fertile provinces of Belfalis and Lebanon. Nature slowly reclaimed abandoned farms. Stone cottages collapsed beneath creeping vines. Roads once crowded with merchants became overgrown. Only rangers and soldiers still wandered many parts of Ithilien, keeping watch for movements from Mordor. The stewards understood that every mile surrendered without resistance brought the shadow one step closer to the White City. So they strengthened Gondor where they could. The Ramas Acor, the great defensive wall surrounding the Pelennor fields, was repaired and expanded. Fortresses guarding mountain passes received new garrisons. Deacon Hills stretched from Minas Tirith toward Rohan, standing ready to summon aid should the need ever arise. Though they hoped never to light them, they carefully maintained each beacon. One day, they knew, Gondor might stand in desperate need of friends. To the west, the friendship between Gondor and the Rohirrim grew stronger with every generation. The kingdom of Rohan had not always existed. Long before, those rolling plains had belonged to Gondor itself. But when the people known as the Eotheodor rode south to aid Steward Sirion against the Volkov, a great alliance was forged. As a reward for their courage, Sirion granted them the province of Calenardon. There, they founded the kingdom of Rohan. The oath of Ero was sworn. It bound the two realms together in friendship that neither time nor hardship would easily break. If Gondor called, Rohan would answer. If Rohan faced destruction, Gondor would ride to its defense. It was one of the wisest decisions any steward ever made, for Gondor could no longer stand entirely alone. Far to the south, however, danger continued to grow. The corsairs of Umbar never forgot the bitterness born during the Kin-strife centuries before. Descendants of Castamir still ruled the Great Haven. Their black ships crossed the Bay of Belfalas again and again, raiding coastal towns and attacking Gondor's merchant vessels. Many lives were lost defending the southern shores. Entire fleets were built simply to keep the corsairs at bay. No sooner would one threat be contained than another appeared. Haradrim warriors crossed the southern deserts. Easterling chieftains tested the eastern frontier. Orcs emerged from the mountains of shadow whenever vigilance weakened. The stewards rarely enjoyed long years of peace, yet they remained steadfast. They governed not for glory, but for duty. Many historians would later overlook them because they wore no crowns. But without the stewards, Gondor might well have vanished centuries before the War of the Ring. They preserved the kingdom through patience rather than conquest. They repaired roads, maintained laws, strengthened defenses, stored grain against famine, raised new generations of soldiers. While songs often celebrate the victories of kings, it is quieter labor that allows kingdoms to survive. Among all the stewards, few were more respected than Ecthelion I. He restored much of Gondor's strength after difficult years of war. His successors continued that work, each passing the white rod to his son with the same solemn promise made by Mardil generations earlier. Not one of them declared himself king. Not one placed a crown upon his own head. The empty throne remained untouched. Its silence became almost sacred. Visitors entering the Hall of Kings often found their eyes drawn toward it. The absence of a ruler spoke louder than any royal proclamation. It reminded every steward that his authority was borrowed, not inherited, not owned, until the return of the king. As the centuries slipped by, however, that hope began to seem little more than an old legend. Children learned the names of Elendil and Isildur as distant figures from history. The royal line appeared to have vanished forever. Many quietly wondered whether the kings would ever return at all. Beyond the Efeldua, another ruler pondered the same question. For deep within the darkness of Mordor, Sauron had risen once more. His strength grew year by year. His servants multiplied. His gaze turned steadily westward. The long watch kept by the stewards was nearing its greatest test. And before many years had passed, one steward would bear a burden heavier than any who had come before him. His name was Denethor, son of Ecthelion, and the fate of Gondor would soon rest upon his shoulders. For more than 900 years, the ruling stewards had preserved Gondor. One after another, they accepted the white rod with the same solemn promise. They would govern, they would defend, they would endure, but they would never claim the crown that belonged to another. It was a remarkable act of restraint. Few rulers in the history of Middle-earth had possessed such authority without allowing power to consume them. The stewards knew that they were caretakers, guardians of a kingdom that was waiting for its true king. Yet as the centuries slipped by, that hope became increasingly difficult to hold. No heir appeared. The line of Isildur seemed to have vanished into the wilds of the north. The ancient kingdom of Arnor had long since fallen. Only scattered rangers wandered its forgotten lands, protecting roads that few travelers still used. To most people living in Gondor, the return of the king had become little more than an old story. A beautiful story, but a story nonetheless. It was into this world that Denethor, son of Ecthelion II, was born. From an early age, he showed uncommon intelligence. He learned the histories of Númenor with remarkable speed. He studied languages preserved from ancient days. He possessed a sharp memory and an even sharper mind. Those who met him often found him intimidating. He observed everything, forgot almost nothing. Even before becoming steward, Denethor had earned a reputation as one of the most capable men in Gondor. Yet wisdom alone did not define him. He was also proud, strong-willed, relentlessly determined. He believed that Gondor survived because its people refused to surrender, regardless of the odds before them. In that belief, he was not wrong. When his father, Ecthelion II, died, Denethor accepted the White Rod and became the 26th ruling steward of Gondor. Like every steward before him, he climbed to the Hall of Kings. There stood the empty throne, silent, unclaimed, waiting. Denethor did not sit upon it. Instead, he took his place beneath it, acknowledging once again that he ruled only until the rightful king returned. Whether he truly believed such a king still existed, few could say. During Denethor's rule, Gondor stood under constant pressure. The enemy had grown stronger than at any time since the fall of Barad-dûr. Across the Anduin, Minas Morgul glowed with its pale, unnatural light. Orcs gathered in increasing numbers. Haradrim answered the summons of Mordor. Easterlings marched west beneath unfamiliar banners. Every report reaching Minas Tirith carried the same message. War was coming. Denethor prepared as best he could. Storehouses were filled with grain. The walls of Minas Tirith were carefully maintained. Messengers rode frequently between the provinces. The beacon hills were kept ready. Every fortress along Gondor's borders remained alert. The steward understood that preparation often determines the outcome of battles long before swords are drawn. Among Denethor's greatest strengths was his ability to judge character. He recognized courage in others. He rewarded competence. He expected excellence from those who served beneath him. None earned his respect more than Captain Vorongil. For several years, this mysterious warrior served Gondor with remarkable distinction. Tall, wise, and exceptional commander. Vorongil led daring campaigns against the corsairs of Humbar, destroying much of their fleet before it could threaten Gondor's southern coast. His victories earned admiration throughout the kingdom. Many believed he would one day become Gondor's greatest captain. Then, without warning, Vorongil departed. He offered no explanation, no request for reward. He simply disappeared. Few knew that Vorongil was in truth Aragorn, son of Arathorn, last chieftain of the Dúnedain, and the hidden heir of Isildur. Denethor never learned the whole truth, yet he sensed something unusual about the northern captain. Perhaps even then, he suspected that fate had brought an extraordinary man into his service. Years passed. Denethor married Findoes of Dol Amroth, a noblewoman renowned for her grace and kindness. Together, they had 2 sons, Boromir and, later, Faramir. Though brothers, they grew into very different men. Boromir was tall, fearless, and immensely popular among Gondor's soldiers. He possessed natural leadership. Wherever he walked, men found confidence. He loved his city deeply and never doubted his duty to defend it. Denethor saw much of himself in Boromir. Strength, resolve, an unshakable will. Faramir inherited different gifts. He loved history, books, quiet reflection. He possessed wisdom beyond his years, and often looked beyond immediate victories to consider the greater picture. Like his mother, he carried both gentleness and compassion without sacrificing courage. He fought bravely whenever duty demanded it. But unlike many warriors, he never delighted in battle itself. As Faramir would one day say, he loved only that which he defended, not the sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness. These qualities reminded many of Gandalf. Indeed, the wizard held great affection for the younger son. Denethor noticed. And though he respected Gandalf's wisdom, he never entirely trusted him. The steward believed that every counselor served his own purpose, however noble that purpose appeared. He preferred to rely upon his own judgment more than anyone else's. As the years passed, another burden quietly settled upon Denethor. Hidden deep within Minas Tirith rested one of the ancient seeing stones, a Palantir. These remarkable relics had come from Númenor itself, allowing those with sufficient strength to look across great distances. The Palantir were not evil. They revealed truth, but truth, when carefully controlled by a stronger will, could become a dangerous weapon. Denethor believed he possessed the strength to use the stone. In many ways, he did. Unlike countless others, he was never dominated completely by Sauron. His mind proved too disciplined, too powerful. Yet each time he looked into the Palantir, the Dark Lord ensured that Denethor saw only what served Mordor's purpose. Great armies gathering, the endless forges of Barad-dûr, the overwhelming strength of the enemy. Never lies, only carefully chosen truths. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, hope began to erode. The steward continued governing with unwavering determination. His people saw only a proud ruler who never yielded. Few realized the prided struggle unfolding within his heart. Each night seemed darker than the last, each report more troubling. Each year brought Gondor closer to the war everyone knew could no longer be avoided. Denethor refused to surrender, but he had begun to wonder whether victory was still possible. And beyond the eastern mountains, the shadow was finally ready to make its greatest assault. The long years of waiting were over. The Siege of Minas Tirith was about to begin. For countless generations, the White City had stood as the greatest fortress of men. Its 7 levels rose one above another, carved into the shoulder of Mount Mindolin, like a mountain shaped by patient hands. Towering walls of white stone caught the morning light. The White Tower stood above them all, its banner visible for many miles across the Pelennor fields. To those approaching from the west, Minas Tirith appeared eternal. A city that could never fall. Yet every stone within its walls had been laid for one purpose, not merely to inspire admiration, but to withstand the day when darkness would return. That day had finally come. From the heights of Minas Tirith, the watchmen looked east. Beyond the broad waters of the Anduin, an unnatural glow burned through the night. Minas Morgul. For centuries, the corrupted city had remained a constant reminder of Gondor's greatest loss. Now its gates opened, slowly at first, then wider, until an endless host began to emerge. Orcs marched in ranks that seemed without end. Trolls lumbered beside towering siege engines. Haradrim carried scarlet banners that rippled beneath the darkened sky. Easterlings advanced in disciplined formations, their polished armor reflecting the pale light of the poisoned moon. Above them all rode the Nazgûl. The air itself seemed to grow colder as they passed. Those who witnessed the army later struggled to describe its true size. Many simply said that the land itself appeared to move. In Minas Tirith, preparations had already begun. Denethor wasted no time. Every gate was inspected, every wall strengthened. Archers filled the battlements. Blacksmiths labored day and night repairing armor and sharpening swords. Messengers hurried through every level of the city, carrying orders from the steward. The great beacon atop Amon Din was lit, then another and another. One by one, the fires leapt across the White Mountains. A chain of living light stretching westward into the distance. The ancient promise made centuries before by Sirion and Orel had finally been called upon. Gondor was asking for aid. Far away in the golden hall of Meduseld, the beacons blazed against the night. Rohan had received the message. Meanwhile, thousands of ordinary people entered Minas Tirith, seeking refuge. Farmers abandoned their homes upon the Pelennor. Families drove wagons loaded with whatever possessions they could carry. Children clutched blankets, while elderly parents leaned upon younger shoulders. The city became crowded with voices, with fear, with quiet prayers whispered in the darkness. Many understood that if Minas Tirith fell, there would be nowhere left to flee. Among those preparing the city's defense stood Gandalf, no longer merely a wandering wizard. He had become the calm center around which frightened hearts gathered. Where others saw despair, Gandalf reminded them of duty. He walked the streets, spoke with soldiers, encouraged healers, comforted children. His presence alone gave courage to many who believed themselves unequal to the coming battle. Faramir also returned to Minas Tirith. He had defended the crossings of the Anduin for as long as possible, delaying the advance from Mordor despite overwhelming odds. His rangers had fought with extraordinary courage, but no courage could stop an army of such size forever. Forced to retreat, Faramir rode back through the city gates with only a fraction of the men who had ridden east beside him. His armor bore the marks of desperate fighting. His face revealed weeks without rest. Still, his duty was not yet finished. Denethor ordered him to defend Osgiliath once more. The command shocked many who heard it. The ruined city no longer possessed walls capable of resisting such numbers. Holding it would be nearly impossible. Yet Faramir obeyed without protest. He gathered his exhausted soldiers and rode out again beneath the shadow of Mordor. Few expected them to return. The defense collapsed exactly as many had feared. Wave after wave of enemies poured across the river. The Rangers fought until they could fight no longer. Faramir himself was struck down during the retreat. His companions carried him back through the gates of Minas Tirith, gravely wounded and burning with fever. When Denethor looked upon his surviving son, something inside him began to break. Boromir was already gone. Now Faramir lay close to death. The steward, who had endured decades of hardship without bending, found himself crushed beneath grief. His long struggle against despair finally reached its darkest hour. Outside the city, the army of Mordor completed its encirclement. Great trenches were dug across the Pelennor fields. Siege towers rolled steadily forward. Massive catapults hurled stones against the white walls. Some carried fire. Others carried something far more terrible, the heads of fallen soldiers. A cruel attempt to break the spirit of those still defending the city. But the defenders did not abandon their posts. Archers answered every assault. The great walls held. Again and again, the attackers climbed ladders only to be thrown back. Stones crashed down upon siege engines. Boiling pitch poured from the battlements. Every level of Minas Tirith became a fortress unto itself. Then, the ground itself began to tremble. Drawn by enormous beasts, the great battering ram, Grond, approached the city's main gate. It had been forged after the ancient hammer once wielded by Morgoth himself. Its iron head resembled a ravening wolf. Each strike echoed across the Pelennor like distant thunder. The gate of Minas Tirith shuddered. Once, twice, again. The defenders watched in silence. Many had believed no weapon could break those ancient doors. Yet Grond continued its relentless assault. With one final blow, the great gate burst apart. Splintered wood and twisted iron crashed inward. Smoke rolled through the opening. There, framed by the shattered entrance, stood the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar. His black horse pawed at the broken stones. No living face could be seen beneath his crown, only darkness. Behind him waited the vast armies of Mordor. Before him stood Gandalf the White. For one brief moment, everything became still. The fate of Gondor hung upon a single heartbeat, and in the distance, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, came the sound of horns echoing across the hills. Rohan had answered. The horns of Rohan rolled across the Pelennor fields like distant thunder. At first, only a few defenders upon the walls heard them. Some lifted their heads, wondering if they had imagined the sound. Then the call came again, long, deep, clear against the darkness. Hope, which had nearly vanished from Minas Tirith, returned in a single breath. Far beyond the northern edge of the battlefield, sunlight broke through low clouds as thousands of horsemen appeared upon the ridges. Their spears glittered, their banners snapped proudly in the wind. At their head rode King Theoden, old in years, yet magnificent in spirit. His white horse, Snowmane, carried him toward the greatest battle of his life. The riders of the mark did not slow. They descended the slopes with increasing speed until the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath countless hooves. The thunder of their charge echoed between the White Mountains and the Anduin. Then they struck. The first ranks of Mordor's army shattered beneath the impact. Orcs scattered in every direction. Haradrim struggled to reform their lines before another wave of riders swept through them. The long spears of the Rohirrim broke upon shields and armor, but swords quickly followed. The battle, which only moments before had seemed hopeless, became chaos. For the first time that day, the servants of Sauron were driven backward. From the walls of Minas Tirith, weary soldiers watched in amazement. Many who had believed death inevitable now raised their weapons once more. The White City had not been abandoned. Its oldest ally had kept its oath, yet victory remained far away. The Witch King turned from the shattered gate and rode toward the new threat. Wherever he passed, courage faltered. Even seasoned warriors found themselves gripped by an ancient fear that no training could overcome. King Theoden continued leading the charge despite the growing darkness. His riders followed without hesitation. Then, the Lord of the Nazgul descended upon him. The king's horse stumbled beneath the terror radiating from the ringwraith. Snowmane fell. Theoden was thrown violently to the ground. His loyal guards rushed forward, but few could stand before the Witch King. Among those who remained was a young rider known to all as Dernhelm. Few suspected the truth. Beneath the helmet and armor stood Eowyn, niece of the king. Forbidden to ride to war, she had come anyway. Beside her stood Merry, a humble hobbit from the Shire, whose courage far exceeded his size. The Witch King mocked them. No living man, he declared, could hinder him. Then Eowyn removed her helmet. Her golden hair caught the morning light. "I am no man." The words rang across the battlefield. What followed became one of the most remarkable moments in the history of the Third Age. While Merry struck the ringwraith from behind with his ancient blade, weakening the dark enchantments that protected him, Éowyn drove her sword into the unseen form beneath the black mantle. The ward of the Nazgul cried out. His crown fell empty upon the ground. The greatest servant of Sauron vanished. The prophecy spoken long before had at last been fulfilled. Yet the battle still raged. King Theoden did not rise again. Mortally wounded, he looked once upon his beloved niece before drawing his final breath. The riders of Rohan mourned even as they continued to fight. Their king had fallen in victory. Farther south, upon the Pelennor, another fleet approached the Harland. From the city walls, many defenders watched with despair. The black sails of Umbar filled the river. For generations, those sails had brought only ruin to Gondor's shores. Some believed all was lost. The corsairs had arrived at the worst possible moment. Then, something unexpected happened. The black ships drew closer. Their sails still flew, but the banners above them changed. Instead of the emblem of the corsairs, the standard of Elendil unfurled in the wind. A great tree in bloom, 7 stars, a shining crown. Upon the foremost ship stood Aragorn, son of Arathorn. The hidden heir of Isildur had finally come to Gondor. Beside him marched the Dunedain of the north, the sons of Elrond, and warriors gathered from the southern provinces. The corsair fleet had not come to destroy Minas Tirith. It had been captured. Fresh soldiers poured onto the battlefield. Already exhausted armies found renewed strength. The forces of Mordor, pressed now from every direction, slowly began to break. By evening, the Pelennor fields fell silent. Smoke drifted across the plain. Broken weapons lay scattered among thousands of fallen warriors. Victory had been won, but its cost was written across the field. Theoden was dead. Countless soldiers from Gondor and Rohan would never return home. The White City had survived. Its people had endured. Yet everyone understood one truth. Sauron himself had not been defeated. His greatest army had fallen. His greatest captain had perished. But the Dark Ward still ruled within Barad-dûr. As long as the One Ring endured, the war could never truly end. It was then that Aragorn revealed the quiet wisdom that had guided him throughout his life. Rather than claiming immediate glory after saving Minas Tirith, he recognized what few others yet understood. Victory could never be won by strength of arms alone. No army in Middle-earth possessed the power to overthrow Mordor while Sauron remained at the height of his strength. Instead, Aragorn proposed one final act of courage. The captains of the West would march upon the Black Gate itself. Not because they hoped to conquer Mordor, but because they hoped to distract the eye of Sauron. Every soldier who answered that call understood the odds. Few expected to return. They marched anyway. For behind the armies, far beyond every battlefield, 2 small figures continued a journey that would determine the fate of every kingdom in Middle-earth. As Aragorn departed Minas Tirith, many who watched him pass felt something difficult to explain. They had seen great captains before. They had followed brave leaders into countless battles, but this man carried himself differently. Not with pride, not with ambition, but with quiet certainty. It was the bearing of one who served before he ruled. And though few dared speak the thought aloud, many hearts had already begun to wonder whether the king that Gondor had awaited for nearly 1,000 years had finally returned. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields had been won. The White City still stood. Its banners fluttered above walls blackened by fire and scarred by stone. The streets, once filled with fear and uncertainty, slowly came alive again. Healers moved tirelessly among the wounded. Families searched the crowds for familiar faces. Churches, halls, and quiet gardens became places of mourning, where the names of the fallen were spoken with reverence. Victory had come. But like every victory in the history of Middle-earth, it had demanded a heavy price. Yet the greatest moment in Gondor's history was still to come. While Aragorn and the captains of the West marched toward the Black Gate, another struggle unfolded far beyond their sight. Deep within Mordor, where no army could have fought its way, two unlikely travelers continued onward. Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee. Every step they took carried the weight of every kingdom. They climbed through ash and broken stone, crossed lands where nothing green had grown for centuries, endured hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and despair. No songs were sung for them as they walked. No armies cleared their path. No banners marked their journey. Only quiet perseverance. At the Black Gate, Aragorn stood before the overwhelming armies of Sauron. He knew his force could not win. That had never been the purpose. Every hour they delayed the enemy's attention gave Frodo another chance to reach the fires of Mount Doom. The captains fought not for victory, but for hope. Then, without warning, the earth began to shake. Far to the south, Mount Doom erupted. Great clouds of ash climbed into the heavens. The very foundations of Mordor trembled. The dark tower of Barad-dûr, whose foundations had endured since the Second Age, suddenly began to collapse. Its mighty walls cracked, its towers leaned, then they fell. Stone shattered upon stone until nothing remained but ruin. Across the battlefield before the Black Gate, confusion swept through the armies of Mordor. The orcs faltered. The trolls stopped. The Nazgûl, racing toward Mount Doom, vanished forever. Sauron had fallen, not by strength of arms, not by conquest, but because the One Ring had at last been unmade. The shadow that had haunted Middle-earth for thousands of years was gone. For the second time in history, Gondor had survived the fall of the Dark Lord. When Aragorn returned to Minas Tirith, he did not immediately enter the city as a conqueror. Instead, he waited outside its gates. The people of Gondor had lived under the Stewards for nearly 1,000 years. They deserved the chance to welcome their king freely. Soon afterward came the day that generations had believed would never arrive. Within the courts of Minas Tirith, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, descendant of Isildur and Elendil, was crowned king of the reunited kingdom. The crown placed upon his head was not a new creation. It was the ancient winged crown of Gondor, the very symbol worn by the kings of old. At last, the empty throne was empty no longer. Those who witnessed the ceremony later spoke not of overwhelming grandeur, but of profound peace. It felt less like the beginning of something unfamiliar, and more like the restoration of something that had always belonged. The long line of the stewards had fulfilled its promise. For nearly 1,000 years they had guarded a kingdom that was never truly theirs. Now, at last, they could lay down that burden. Among them stood Faramir, having survived his terrible wounds through the healing hands of Aragorn, he became Prince of Ithilien, charged with restoring the land that had suffered beneath the shadow of Minas Morgul for so long. No man could erase centuries of darkness overnight, but life slowly returned. Trees were planted once again, villages were rebuilt, roads reopened. Birdsong gradually replaced the silence that had haunted the forests of Ithilien. Elsewhere, Gondor also began to heal. The shattered great gate of Minas Tirith was rebuilt with stronger materials than before. Fields upon the Pelennor were replanted. Homes destroyed during the siege rose again from fresh-cut stone. Trade returned to Pelegir. The corsairs of Umbar no longer threatened every voyage upon the sea. Peace spread farther than it had in many generations. Aragorn ruled not only as King of Gondor, but also of Arnor, reuniting the kingdoms first established by Elendil after the downfall of Númenor. The dream that had seemed impossible since the days of Isildur finally became reality. The north and the south stood together once more. Old roads were repaired, forgotten cities received new life. The scattered Dunedain emerged from the shadows to help rebuild the lands they had protected in secret for so many centuries. Friendships also flourished. The alliance between Gondor and Rohan remained as strong as ever. King Eomer, who had succeeded Theoden, renewed the ancient oaths between the two realms. Elves still visited Minas Tirith from time to time. Dwarves came to trade stone and metalwork. Even the hobbits of the Shire became known in the White City, though they themselves preferred the quiet fields of home to the grandeur of royal courts. And so began what historians would call the Fourth Age, the Age of Men. The elves slowly departed across the sea. The magic that had shaped so much of Middle-earth gently faded. The world became quieter, less wondrous in some ways, yet perhaps more hopeful in others, for its future now rested not in immortal hands, but in the choices of ordinary people. Looking back across the long history of Gondor, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Its greatest strength was never its towering walls, nor its mighty armies, nor even the noble blood of Númenor. Again and again, Gondor survived because its people refused to surrender. From Elendil, escaping the drowning of Númenor, to Menelndil, rebuilding after the last alliance. From the survivors of the Kin-strife, to those who endured the Great Plague. From the stewards who guarded an empty throne for nearly 1,000 years, to the soldiers who stood upon the walls of Minas Tirith, believing they would never see another sunrise. Each generation carried the burden left by those before it. Each generation preserved hope for those yet to come. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Gondor. Not merely a kingdom, but a reminder that even in the longest night, there are always those willing to keep watch until the dawn. And sometimes, after centuries of waiting, the king truly does return.